Most people believe genius comes from trying harder. They believe if you just strain your brain a little more, push a little longer, grind a little deeper, brilliance will eventually appear. That sounds noble. It's also mostly wrong. Let me explain something very simple. When you try too hard to be smart, you stop being curious. And curiosity, not effort, is where genius lives. There's a big difference between forcing your brain and playing with a problem. When you force it, you're tense. When you play, you're free. And thinking, real thinking, only happens when you're free. If you sit at a desk and tell yourself, I must solve this, I must prove I'm intelligent, I must not fail, your brain goes into defense mode. It becomes cautious. It avoids risk. It starts protecting your ego instead of exploring ideas. But exploration is messy. Exploration requires being wrong. Exploration requires looking foolish. And that's where most people quit. They try harder to look smart instead of trying to understand. Now, here's something interesting. When you're genuinely curious about something, not because it's on a test, not because someone told you it's important, but because you want to know, your brain behaves completely differently. You ask questions, you take things apart, you say, that doesn't make sense, and instead of pretending it does, you chase it down. That's not trying harder, that's playing seriously. There's a strange paradox here. The more you care about appearing intelligent, the less intelligent your thinking becomes, because now your goal isn't truth, it's approval. And approval is a terrible compass for discovery. Real insight often comes when you relax your grip. Have you ever noticed how solutions appear in the shower, or while walking, or when you've stopped obsessing over the answer? That's not magic. That's your brain finally being allowed to wander. Wandering is not laziness. Wandering is how connections form. Genius isn't about mental strain. It's about mental freedom. Let's take a simple example. Suppose you're trying to understand how something works. You could memorize formulas, repeat definitions, and push yourself to study longer hours. Or you could ask, what is actually happening here? What would happen if I change this? Why does this assumption exist? One approach exhausts you. The other energizes you. One tries harder. The other digs deeper. And depth beats force every time. There's also another trap. When people try harder, they often narrow their vision. They focus so intensely on one path that they ignore alternatives. But breakthroughs usually happen sideways. They happen when you connect two unrelated ideas. They happen when you allow yourself to say, this might be a silly question. There are no silly questions, only suppressed ones. And suppressed curiosity is the fastest way to kill genius. If you want to destroy creativity in a child, reward them only when they get the right answer. If you want to destroy creativity in yourself, only feel proud when you appear competent. The moment you fear being wrong, you stop discovering what's right. Trying harder often means adding pressure, but pressure collapses play, and play is not childish. It's experimental freedom. The greatest thinkers weren't grinding their minds into dust. They were obsessed with understanding. They enjoyed puzzles. They laughed at mistakes. They followed interesting questions wherever they led, even if those questions made them unpopular. There's a quiet confidence in saying, I don't know, because now you're free to find out. Trying harder says, I must prove something. Curiosity says, let's see what's true. Those are very different motivations. One is ego-driven. The other is truth-driven. And truth-driven thinking is light. It moves easily. It adapts. It questions itself. Ego-driven thinking is rigid. It defends. It resists change. If you really want to become brilliant at something, stop straining to be brilliant. Instead, become intensely interested. Take things apart. Explain them in simple words. Find the gaps in your understanding. Enjoy not knowing, because that's where the adventure begins. Genius is not a product of pressure. It's a product of fascination. So the next time you feel stuck, don't try harder. Try differently. Loosen your grip. Ask a better question. Be willing to look foolish. And give your mind room to breathe. Because the mind, when it's free, does extraordinary things. But when it's forced, it shuts down. And that's why trying harder often kills genius. Most people are taught that success comes from effort. If you want better grades, study longer. If you want mastery, practice more hours. If you want to become exceptional, push harder than everyone else. Effort becomes the hero of the story. And effort is important, but it is not the source of genius. Curiosity is. There is a crucial difference between working hard because you are fascinated and working hard because you are afraid. One feels light, the other feels heavy. One expands your thinking, the other narrows it. When you are genuinely curious about something, you don't need discipline to stay focused. You naturally lean forward. Questions arise without force. You begin to poke at the edges of the idea. You turn it around in your mind. You test it. You doubt it. You play with it. That kind of engagement doesn't drain you, it energizes you. Effort driven by pressure feels very different. It says, I must understand this. I must perform. I must prove I'm capable. The brain under pressure becomes cautious. It looks for the safest path to the correct answer. It avoids unusual ideas because unusual ideas might be wrong. And the fear of being wrong suffocates creativity. Curiosity, on the other hand, is not concerned with looking correct. It wants to see what's true. It doesn't mind getting lost for a while. In fact, getting lost is part of the fun. When you follow curiosity, you're willing to ask basic questions. You're willing to admit confusion. You're willing to dismantle an idea completely just to see how it works. That freedom is where insight lives. Think about how children learn. They don't begin with effort. They begin with fascination. They ask why endlessly. They experiment without embarrassment. They try strange combinations. They aren't protecting an identity of being smart. They are exploring. As we grow older, something changes. We start trying to protect our image. We want to appear competent. We want approval. So we replace curiosity with effort. We replace exploration with performance. And slowly our thinking becomes mechanical. The paradox is this: the more you chase intelligence through effort alone, the further you move from genuine understanding. Because real understanding is not memorizing answers, it's wrestling with questions. When you are curious, you slow down. You don't rush to the solution. You ask, what does this actually mean? You try to explain it in simple language. If you can't explain it, simply, you know you don't understand it yet. That realization isn't discouraging. It's exciting. It gives you a direction to explore. Curiosity transforms difficulty into a puzzle rather than a threat. Effort says, this is hard, I need to push harder. Curiosity says, this is interesting, why is it this way? One approach exhausts you, the other sustains you. The most creative breakthroughs often come from people who are deeply interested, not those who are merely disciplined. Interest keeps you in the game long enough to notice patterns others miss. It allows your mind to wander across fields and connect ideas that don't seem related. That wandering is not laziness. It is how original thoughts are formed. When you care about understanding more than appearing capable, your mind relaxes. And when it relaxes, it becomes flexible. Flexible minds see more possibilities. They take risks. They recover quickly from mistakes because mistakes are information, not verdicts. So if you want to cultivate genius in any area, don't ask how to try harder. Ask what truly fascinates you. Follow the questions that pull you forward. Allow confusion to guide you instead of intimidate you, because in the end, genius is not sustained by force. It is sustained by curiosity. There is a subtle trap that catches intelligent people more than anyone else. It's the desire to look smart, not to understand deeply, not to discover something new, but to appear intelligent in the eyes of others. And the moment that becomes your goal, your thinking begins to shrink. When you try to look smart, you start managing impressions instead of exploring ideas. You choose safe answers over honest ones. You avoid questions that might expose confusion. You nod along when something doesn't make sense. You defend positions you haven't examined. In short, you protect your ego instead of pursuing truth. The mind cannot do both at the same time. If you are busy protecting your image, you cannot be fully curious. Curiosity requires vulnerability. It requires the willingness to say, I don't get it. That sentence is incredibly powerful. It opens the door to real learning. but it also risks embarrassment. And so most people avoid saying it. Imagine sitting in a room where a complex idea is being discussed. You don't fully understand, but everyone else seems confident. If your goal is to look intelligent, you stay quiet. You might even repeat the same complicated words you just heard. You leave the room with your reputation intact and your understanding unchanged. But if your goal is clarity, you ask the simple question, the basic one, the one that feels almost childish. And often you'll discover that others were confused too, but afraid to admit it. The illusion of collective understanding disappears the moment someone values truth over pride. Trying to look smart creates a kind of mental tension. You start filtering your thoughts before you express them. You avoid unconventional ideas because they might sound foolish. You aim for polished answers rather than honest exploration. That filtering process blocks creativity. Real thinking is messy. It involves half-formed ideas. It involves mistakes. It involves changing your mind. If you're attached to appearing consistent and clever, you won't allow yourself that messiness. And without messiness, there is no discovery. There's another problem. When you try to look smart, you become attached to being right. Being right feels like validation. Being wrong feels like failure. So instead of examining opposing ideas carefully, you defend your own. You search for evidence that supports you and ignore evidence that challenges you. That isn't thinking. It's protecting. But understanding grows through correction. Every time you realize you were wrong, your model of the world becomes slightly more accurate. That should feel like progress. Yet ego turns it into defeat. The irony is striking. The people who appear the most confident are often the least curious, and the people who openly admit confusion often end up understanding things far more deeply. When your identity is tied to being smart, every conversation becomes a test. Every problem becomes a performance. That constant performance pressure limits your ability to take intellectual risks. And without risk, there are no breakthroughs. If instead you detach your identity from intelligence, something changes. You become free to experiment, free to ask basic questions, free to explore unusual paths. You no longer need to prove yourself in every moment. You can simply investigate. That freedom sharpens the mind. Looking smart is about external approval. Understanding is about internal clarity. One depends on others. The other depends on honesty. And honesty with yourself is the foundation of genuine insight. The moment you stop trying to impress and start trying to understand, your thinking deepens. You listen better. You question assumptions. You admit gaps. You revise ideas. You grow. Trying to look smart builds a fragile identity. Trying to understand builds a powerful mind. And only one of those leads to real genius. There's something peculiar about the way the mind works. The harder you squeeze it, the less it gives you. The more tightly you try to control every thought, the more rigid and predictable those thoughts become. And yet some of the most brilliant ideas in history appeared not during moments of strain, but during moments of ease. Think about how often solutions arrive when you're not actively forcing them. You step away from the desk. You take a walk. You wash dishes. You lie in bed. Suddenly the answer appears, sometimes fully formed, sometimes as a small spark. That isn't an accident. That is how a relaxed mind operates. When you are under pressure, your brain shifts into a narrow mode of thinking. It focuses on immediate threats and clear outcomes. This is useful if you're escaping danger. It is not useful if you're trying to discover something new. Creativity requires mental flexibility. Pressure reduces flexibility. A tense mind looks for the quickest acceptable answer. A relaxed mind explores alternatives. Mental freedom doesn't mean laziness. It means giving your thoughts room to move. When you allow your mind to wander across related ideas, it begins forming connections you didn't consciously design. It links patterns from different experiences. It combines concepts from separate fields. That is where originality comes from. Unexpected connections. If you are gripping a problem too tightly, you prevent that process. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle by staring at one piece over and over. You examine its shape, its color, its edges, but you refuse to look at the rest. Oh, F the pieces. Eventually you exhaust yourself. Now imagine stepping back and looking at the whole table. Suddenly, relationships appear. The solution becomes clearer not because you tried harder, but because you widened your view. Mental freedom widens the view. There is also an emotional component. When you are relaxed, you are less afraid of being wrong. You are more willing to test unusual ideas. You can say, what if this assumption is incorrect, without feeling threatened? That simple question can unlock entire new directions of thought. Under pressure, you cling to safe assumptions. You repeat familiar patterns. You aim for certainty. But certainty too early in the thinking process is dangerous. It stops exploration. Breakthroughs often come from what seems like distraction. You read something unrelated to your problem. You have a conversation about a different topic. You watch how something works in another field. And suddenly, an analogy forms. That analogy becomes insight. This happens because a relaxed mind is open. It allows information to flow between areas that usually remain separate. When you are rigidly focused, those pathways close. There's a reason play is so powerful. When you play, you are experimenting without fear of failure. You test possibilities simply to see what happens. That playful attitude encourages creativity because it removes the pressure of performance. You're not trying to prove anything, you're investigating. Serious thinking doesn't have to feel heavy. In fact, the heaviest thinking often produces the shallowest results. Lightness, curiosity, and flexibility produce depth. Mental freedom also includes the willingness to pause if you hit a wall. Sometimes the most productive action is to stop. Step away. Let the problem sit in the background of your mind. Your subconscious continues working even when you are not consciously analyzing. When you return, you often see the problem differently. Trying harder often narrows your mental field. Relaxing your grip expands it. And expansion is what allows new ideas to enter. The mind is not a machine that produces insight through force. It is a dynamic system that thrives on openness. When you give it room to breathe, it surprises you. Mental freedom is not the absence of effort. It is the absence of fear. And in that freedom, breakthroughs are born. Most people misunderstand play. They associate it with childhood, with carelessness, with a lack of seriousness. But play, in its pure form, is one of the most powerful modes of thinking available to the human mind. It is not the opposite of serious work. It is serious work without fear. When you approach a problem playfully, you are not trying to protect your reputation. You are not worried about being correct on the first attempt. You are experimenting. You are testing possibilities just to see what happens. That mindset changes everything. Consider the difference between memorizing a formula and asking where it comes from. Memorization is rigid. It says, accept this and move on. Play says, what happens if I change this part? Why does this term exist? What breaks if I remove it? The playful thinker pulls the idea apart and reassembles it. In doing so, they begin to truly understand it. Play invites questions that rigid thinking avoids. When you play with an idea, you give yourself permission to explore unusual angles. You might try an approach that seems inefficient or strange. You might deliberately exaggerate a variable just to observe the consequences. You might simplify the problem to an almost absurd degree to see its core structure. These actions may look unproductive from the outside, but internally they are building deep intuition. Serious play builds intuition because it engages curiosity rather than fear. Fear-based thinking aims for quick correctness. It wants the right answer immediately. It doesn't tolerate detours. But detours are often where insight hides. If you never wander, you never discover unexpected patterns. Think about how scientists experiment. They don't simply repeat established procedures forever. They adjust conditions. They test edge cases. They try combinations that might fail. Failure in that context is not humiliation, it is information. Each failed attempt narrows the possibilities. Each surprising result opens a new path. That is, play at a high level. The same principle applies to learning anything. If you are studying a subject, instead of just consuming information, try teaching it in your own words. Try creating examples. Try inventing problems that test the concept. Try connecting it to something unrelated. That playful interaction forces your brain to engage actively rather than passively. Play also reduces psychological pressure. When you frame an activity as experimentation instead of evaluation, your mind relaxes. A relaxed mind is more creative. It notices details. It makes connections. It tolerates ambiguity. Ambiguity is essential for discovery. Rigid thinking demands clarity from the beginning. Play keeps confusion as part of the process. It says, I don't fully understand this yet, but let's explore. That openness keeps you moving forward instead of shutting down. There is another advantage. Play makes effort sustainable. When you are enjoying the exploration, you can spend hours immersed in it without feeling drained. Time passes differently when curiosity drives your attention. What looks like intense discipline from the outside is often deep fascination from the inside. Play does not mean lack of rigor. You can be precise and playful at the same time. You can demand logical consistency while still exploring freely. In fact, the combination of rigor and playfulness is extremely powerful. Rigor ensures your conclusions are sound. Play ensures your exploration is wide. Without play, thinking becomes mechanical. You follow established paths. You repeat known solutions. You avoid risk. That might produce competence, but it rarely produces originality. Originality requires stepping beyond the obvious, and stepping beyond the obvious requires the courage to experiment without guarantees. Play provides that courage. When you treat problems as puzzles to explore rather than tests to pass, your relationship with difficulty changes. Difficulty becomes intriguing instead of intimidating. You lean toward it instead of away from it. Serious play transforms learning from obligation into investigation. And investigation is where real understanding begins. One of the greatest obstacles to discovery is the fear of being wrong. It sounds harmless at first. Of course, we don't want to be wrong. Being wrong can feel embarrassing. It can feel like a flaw in our intelligence. But that feeling is precisely what prevents growth. Every meaningful insight begins with incomplete understanding. If you already knew the answer, there would be nothing to discover. So the process of learning must involve error. It must involve misunderstanding. It must involve correction. Being wrong is not a detour from the path of discovery. It is the path. Yet most people are trained to avoid mistakes at all costs. In school, wrong answers are marked in red. In conversations, being corrected can feel humiliating. Over time, we develop a subtle habit. Protect yourself from error. Only speak when you're confident. Only attempt what you're sure you can handle. Avoid situations where you might fail publicly. That instinct feels safe, but it quietly shrinks your world. If you never allow yourself to be wrong, you only operate within the boundaries of what you already understand. You stop exploring unfamiliar territory. You stop testing bold ideas. You cling to familiar conclusions, and your thinking becomes predictable. Discovery requires the opposite mindset. Imagine trying to map an unknown landscape. You will make wrong turns. You will draw inaccurate sketches. You will misjudge distances. But with each correction, your map improves. If you refuse to move until you are certain of the path, you will never begin. Mistakes are feedback. They tell you where your assumptions don't match reality. That mismatch is valuable. It reveals the limits of your current model. Once you see those limits, you can adjust. In fact, the faster you're willing to be wrong, the faster you learn. Each error is information. Each failed attempt narrows the possibilities. Each correct ion sharpens your understanding. There is also a psychological shift that happens when you accept being wrong. You detach your identity from your ideas. Instead of thinking, if this idea is wrong, I am foolish, you begin to think, if this idea is wrong, I've learned something. That separation is liberating. When your ego is tied to correctness, every mistake feels like a threat. You defend your conclusions. You resist new evidence. You argue instead of analyze. But when your goal is truth rather than validation, mistakes become useful tools. Consider how experiments work. A scientist forms a hypothesis and tests it. If the result contradicts the hypothesis, that is not a personal failure. It is data. The hypothesis is revised. The process continues. The system is designed to expose error, not hide it. Your thinking should work the same way. If you protect your beliefs from challenge, you freeze them in place. If you expose them to criticism, you strengthen them or replace them with better ones. There is a quiet confidence in saying, I was wrong. It shows that you value accuracy more than pride. It shows that you are committed to refining your understanding rather than preserving your image. And refining understanding is the essence of intelligence. Being wrong also encourages humility. It reminds you that knowledge is provisional, that what seems obvious today may be revised tomorrow. This humility keeps you curious. It prevents the stagnation that comes from thinking you've already arrived. Some of the most significant breakthroughs in history began with someone questioning what everyone else assumed was correct. That required the courage to challenge established ideas and the willingness to risk being wrong in the process. If you fear mistakes, you avoid bold questions. If you embrace mistakes, you pursue them. Real learning is not a straight line upward. It is a series of approximations. Each attempt brings you closer to clarity. So instead of avoiding error, use it. Instead of fearing correction, invite it. Because every time you discover you were wrong, your understanding becomes more precise, and precision built through correction is the foundation of genuine discovery. Pressure is a powerful force. It can make you move faster. It can make you sit longer at a desk. It can make you repeat a task again and again. From the outside, pressure looks productive, but internally it often creates resistance. When you work under pressure alone, you are pushing yourself forward with force. You rely on willpower. You tell yourself that you must continue, even when your mind feels dull. That approach can produce short bursts of output, but it rarely produces brilliance. Fascination works differently. When you are fascinated by something, you don't need to push yourself. Your attention locks in naturally. Hours pass without you noticing. You read more than required. You test ideas beyond what is necessary. You explore side questions simply because they are interesting. Effort is still present, but it feels lighter. It feels voluntary. This is the difference between force and pull. Pressure pushes you from behind. Fascination pulls you forward. When you are pulled by genuine interest, your energy renews itself. You are not constantly negotiating with your motivation. You are not counting minutes. You are not thin. King about how difficult the task feels. Your focus deepens because you care. Care is the hidden fuel of genius. If you examine people who achieve extraordinary understanding in any field, you often find intense interest at the center. They are not merely disciplined, they are captivated. They ask questions long after others lose patience. They revisit problems repeatedly, not because someone demands it, but because they want clarity. Pressure cannot sustain that level of engagement. Under constant pressure, the mind begins to associate the subject with stress. Stress narrows attention. It reduces creativity. It encourages shortcuts. You aim to finish rather than to understand. Over time, your relationship with the work becomes mechanical. Fascination does the opposite. It expands attention. It encourages depth. It makes you comfortable with complexity because complexity is intriguing, not intimidating. There is also a resilience that comes from interest. When you care deeply, obstacles do not immediately discourage you. They become puzzles. You think, why isn't this working? Instead of, I can't do this. That subtle shift keeps you engaged through difficulty. Pressure often ties your effort to external rewards. Grades, praise, recognition, money. Those rewards can motivate action, but they are unstable. When they disappear, motivation fades. Fascination is internal. It does not depend on applause. It exists even when no one is watching. Internal motivation is far more durable. Another important point is sustainability. You can force yourself to sprint, but you cannot sprint forever. If your entire strategy relies on pushing harder, you will eventually burn out. Mental exhaustion is not a sign of genius. It is a sign of imbalance. Fascination allows for endurance. Because you enjoy the process, you can stay with it for years. Long-term engagement is what builds mastery. and mastery built slowly over time is often mistaken for sudden brilliance, but what appears sudden is usually the result of sustained curiosity. This does not mean effort disappears. You will still encounter frustration. You will still need discipline. The difference is that discipline supports your interest rather than replacing it. You are not dragging yourself forward. You are guiding your curiosity with structure. If you find yourself constantly relying on pressure to move, it may be worth asking a deeper question. Are you genuinely interested? If the answer is no, no amount of force will create genius in that direction. Genius grows where fascination lives. When you care deeply, effort becomes natural. When you are merely pressured, effort becomes heavy. And heavy effort may produce results, but light, fascinated effort produces insight. In the long run, it is fascination, not force, that sustains extraordinary thinking.